Good morning and welcome to the 29th episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic.
Yay.
We're your hosts, Andrea and Alex.
Yay.
Well, Alex, it feels like it's been forever since we recorded together.
You said this last time. For the last
It always seems like so long ago.
It was like last week.
Well, Alex, you weren't on yesterday's episode, but Saturday's episode was about different weird events that's happened through history.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those was, I just like for a few minutes talked about the death of Edgar Allan Poe. You do know who that is, right?
Yes, I heard of him as a poet. Yeah.
Well, I didn't go into a lot of detail. I really just gave the gist of what had happened. And I started thinking later that since he's one of my most favorite poets / writers from forever, I should just dedicate one entire episode to that spooky dude.
And we're about to do this right now.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're supposed to do this minute.
Cue the intro.
Triple M Studios proudly presents Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Heroes, Andrea and Alex.
Alright, y'all. So I hope you're having a good start to your week. We are. But
I have work around this time.
yeah, Alex, why don't you tell us a minute about your job?
Oh yeah, update. I have a job now. I work in a veterinary office. I can't speak. I work in a veterinary. I can't say the word.
A veterinarian office.
Yes, I work with the kennels and everything. I take care of the dogs. I feed the dogs. I pet dogs. I clean clothes.
The dog's clothes?
Yes, they're little tiny shirts. And then there's kitties there too, and sometimes a chicken. And bunnies. We saw bunnies and a chicken.
Y'all got chickens.
Well, it was a chicken. I had a chicken cage.
A chicken came in the office. That's cool.
Yeah, so
See, y'all got the best job.
sometimes it's annoying. Most of the time, it's fun. It's a fun job.
And I imagine it can be sad, too.
Yes. Very yes.
Well, our story today is a little bit sad.
Yay. I mean, not yay. That's not fun.
But before we talk about his death, not the chicken, Edgar Allan Poe, we're going to talk about his life a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And Alex, you know that I really got to love him because I do have a tattoo inspired by him. My Nevermore
Yeah.
with the raven tattoo on my chest. So, anyway, he was born in Boston on January 19th, 1809. And he was the second child of an actress named Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. And his dad was also an actor, and his name was David Poe Jr. His father abandoned the family the year after Edgar was born, though. He just took off. And then, a year after that happened, his mom died of the consumption, which we talked about on Saturday. But if you didn't listen, and Alex, you weren't here, and you don't know what the consumption is, it's what they used to call tuberculosis back in those days. And basically, they called it that because tuberculosis literally consumed your body.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so after his dad ran off and his mom passed away, he was taken in by a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia, and that merchant's name was John Allan. And it was him that named the famous poet / writer Edgar Allan Poe. So the Allan came from the man that raised him's last name. But he never legally adopted Edgar. In 1815, the Allan family, along with Edgar, sailed to the UK, where Edgar shortly went to school. First at a grammar school in Scotland, and then at a boarding school in Chelsea. And in 1820, they all moved back to Richmond, Virginia. Now, in February of 1826, Poe registered at the University of Virginia to study ancient and modern languages. Now, during his short stay there at the university, Poe became estranged from John Allan, saying that Allan hadn't given him enough money to cover his registration, tuition, books, fees, all that good stuff, like with staying on campus, like the dorm fees and stuff. But really what had happened was Mr. Allen had gave him more than enough money, but Edgar Allan Poe, he used that money to pay off his gambling debts instead of paying for his college stuff. Now, a year later, he gave up on that college, and since he didn't feel welcome back in Richmond because he'd had the falling out with Mr. Allen, he moved to Boston where he worked as a clerk and a newspaper writer. Well, he couldn't make ends meet doing that, so in May of 1827, he enlisted in the United States Army. He enlisted under an alias, and that alias was Edgar A. Perry, and he claimed to be 22 years old, but he was only actually 18 years old. He first served at Fort Independence at Boston Harbor, where he earned $5 a month. $5 a month, Alex. And it was in that same year that he published his first book of poems, but it was a flop. Like, it didn't sell really good. They only printed like 50 copies, and those 50 copies didn't even hardly sell. Now, his regiment that he was in the Army, they also served at Fort Moultrie in Charleston, down here in South Carolina at one time. After climbing the ranks rather quickly as a non-commissioned officer, he decided he wanted to end his 5-year enlistment early. So what did he do? To get out of the Army, he told his commanding officer that he had enlisted under an alias and he was in a bad predicament with Mr. Allen, and basically that if he left, he just had nowhere to go. So the commanding officer said that if he would reconcile with Mr. Allen, he would allow him to be discharged. So Poe wrote a letter to Mr. Allen several times, and because of the history between the two, he just ignored his pleas for help. So Poe decided that he needed to go see Mr. Allen in person so he could get this all resolved. So he paid him a visit, and unbeknownst to Poe, don't you like that word, unbeknownst?
Poe. Oh. That word. Yeah, that word.
His foster mom, which was Mr. Allen's wife, she had just been buried the day before. So maybe because he had been softened by losing his wife, But anyway, he agreed to support Poe in his efforts, and one of his efforts was to attend West Point Academy. Now, before Poe entered West Point, he moved for a short time over to Baltimore to stay with his aunt, who was a widow, and her daughter, Virginia Eliza Clem. And I believe his brother also lived there with those two ladies.
Yeah.
In September of 1829, a poetry critic gave Poe a raving review for something he had written, and that is one of the things that started getting Poe's name out there as a writer.
Yeah.
Now, the following year, in July, he traveled to West Point, but he wouldn't be there very long. It seemed like Poe didn't stay anywhere a whole long time, but
Yeah.
the following year, which was 1831, just bringing y'all up to speed, he purposely had himself court-martialed so he could be kicked out of West Point. He pleaded not guilty to the charges of gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, or church. He knew that if he pleaded not guilty and then was found guilty, he would be dismissed from West Point. Well, his plan worked, and he was dismissed from West Point. In February of that same year, he headed to New York, and he published a third book of poems that was simply called Poems.
Mm-hmm.
Easy to remember. And to help get the book published, some of his fellow cadets, they each donated like 75 cents each. And you have to remember that was a lot of money back in those days, it's just 3 quarters, but back in those days, that was a lot of money,
Yeah.
So what they did was they put their money together, and he ended up like when they tallied all the money, I think it was like $100 and something that they raised. But anyway, after that, the book was published, and then he returned to Baltimore because his brother was very sick.
Yeah.
And he was very sick partly because he was an alcoholic. Well, after Poe got there, his brother died on August the 1st of 1831. Well, after his brother passed away, Poe started focusing more and more on his career as a writer, and despite the economy being bad, he was the very first American writer that could support himself by writing alone. Like, he didn't have to have, like, side gigs and stuff, like, to support himself. It was just his writing that was supporting him.
Yeah.
Now, during this time, he caught the attention of a man by the name of John P. Kennedy when he published a short story called Message in a Bottle, and that was published in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. Well, Kennedy introduced him to a man by the name of Thomas W. White, who was the editor of Southern Literary Messenger. White hired Poe to be his assistant editor in August of 1835, but just within weeks of getting hired for that job, he was fired for being drunk on the job. So after he lost that job, he went back to Baltimore. And once he was there, you'll never guess what he did.
I don't know.
No guesses?
Nope.
He got a marriage license to marry his first cousin, Virginia.
What's in the episode now?
Is that like... And not only was she his first cousin, she was half his age. She was 13 and he was 26. Who does that? Somehow he convinced Mr. White, who had just fired him for drinking on the job, to hire him back. He promised he'd behave himself. And so Mr. White believed him, and so he and his fiancée slash first cousin and his future mother-in-law slash aunt all moved to Richmond. While he was working for Mr. White, the circulation of the Messenger increased from 700 to 3,500. And, of course, Poe thought he was responsible for all that. That gave him the big head. And now, I'm not talking bad about him, because, like I said, he's one of my literary heroes, okay? Because, I mean, he did write on the dark side. But anyway, in May of 1836, he and Virginia finally tied the knot at a boarding house they were living at. And they had a witness lie for them and say that Virginia was 21 years old, which she was not, you know. Now, through all this time, Poe continued to publish short stories and poems, and some of them were very well reviewed all over the country. Poe was really starting to make a name for himself. He had also become the assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, but he only worked there for about a year when he found work at Graham's Magazine, which was wildly popular during its time. And around the same time, he tried to secure a role in President John Tyler's administration. Now, he had never had, like, political aspirations before, so I don't know why all of a sudden he just wanted to be in a president's administration. Well, he had this friend that went out on a limb for him, and he secured a meeting with President Tyler. I don't know why I said John. Oh, because that's his first name. President Tyler's son, Robert, to talk about the position that Poe wanted in his administration. Well, guess what? Poe missed that meeting and told them that he was sick, but in actuality, he was actually intoxicated, or too intoxicated to show up. Needless to say, he didn't get the job because all those positions have been filled. Yeah. I'm like, man, somebody goes out on a limb for you like that, and you're gonna, like, mess it up like that. Now, on January 29th, 1845, let me back up, because
a little bit.
I got too excited about him being drunk. Okay, so we talked about before that consumption was, like, sweeping the country in great numbers. Well, the Poe family was no exception to those ravaged by it. His wife, Virginia, she started showing signs of having the consumption on one evening in January 1842. She was singing and playing the piano when it happened, and Poe described it as like she had broken a blood vessel in her throat.
Yeah.
She only partially recovered from the disease, and I don't know, maybe it was to kill his emotional pain, but Poe started drinking even more heavily than he already was. He left his job at Graham's to look for a job in the political field. Now, here we go on the January 29th part. My eyes deceived me. Okay. On January 29th, 1845, his most popular poem, The Raven, was published in the Evening Mirror, and it was nearly an overnight sensation. And I mean, I understand why. I mean, it is pretty cool. But that was like the big break that he had been waiting for. And it wasn't very long until his name was known in every home. And as popular as it was, he was only paid $9 for that poem, for it to be published.
Only.
I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, I'm sure that was a lot back then, but
now,
I mean, if you think about how popular, even to this day, that poem is.
Yeah.
And he only received $9 for it. I just don't even know. You know, they say like artists are like starving and can't make ends meet, and I guess I know why. You know. Now, like I said earlier, Virginia never fully recovered from the consumption, and she passed away on January 30th, 1847. Now, it is now thought that, like, the dark, morbid tales and themes of Poe's works is attributed to the loss of several women in his life. And as you can imagine, things really started going downhill for Poe after Virginia died. Now, after she died, he proposed marriage to another poet. Her name was Sarah Helen Whitman, but they were never married because of his drinking and his wild behavior. After that relationship ended, he moved back to Richmond and rekindled a relationship with one of his childhood sweethearts. Her name was Sarah Elmira Royster. Now, there's a lot of misinformation or different opinions on what I'm about to talk about next. So, just bear with me, and I'm going to try and, like, you know.
Yeah.
But, anyway. So, here we go with the part about how he died. Pretty interesting, okay?
Yes.
On September the 27th, 1849, Poe left out of Richmond and he was headed to Philadelphia. He was going there to edit a collection of poems for a poet named Mrs. St. Leon Loud. But Poe never made it to Philadelphia, and he wasn't in New York where he had been living at this time. So where was he? It was a rainy October morning in Baltimore. October the 3rd to be exact. Joseph W. Walker with the Baltimore Sun made his way to Gunner's Hall. It happened to be election day, and Gunner's Hall was being used as a polling station. Now, when Mr. Walker got there at Gunner's Hall, he found a man who was disoriented, disheveled, and lying in a gutter. I don't know what's wrong with my throat today. He was surprised to find that this man was actually Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Walker asked Poe, who was barely conscious, if he knew of anybody there in Baltimore that could take care of his medical needs, and Poe gave him the name Joseph E. Snodgrass. Well, Walker sent Snodgrass a message pleading for his help. During the 4 days that followed, Poe never regained consciousness enough to tell anybody what had happened to him. He was in and out of delirious fits, and he would, say the name Reynolds. And to this day, nobody knows who Reynolds was. No idea who this Reynolds person was. Now, Edgar Allan Poe passed away on October the 7th, 1849, at the age of 40. He was only 40 when he died. Now, there's a lot of theories that popped up about what had actually happened to cause this, like, delirium, and I think he was having hallucinations, and, like, what caused all this. So, you know, he couldn't tell them, you know, he was unconscious for those 4 days, you know. So in 1867, there was a biographer. Her name was E. Oak Smith, and she wrote in her article that was titled Autobiography. I'm going to try that again.
That's not how you say it.
I think Mommy needs a nap. Autobiographic Notes, Edgar Allan Poe, that was the name of it. That a woman had accused him of injuring her, and he was beaten by an unknown person. There were several other references by others over the years that stated that Poe had been beaten unmercifully by ruffians. One of those, I think your tag team should be called the Ruffians. But anyway, one of those even said that he had met up with some of his former West Point cadet friends who invited him to a night of drinking. But after one glass of champagne, he became madly drunk and left his friends to go wander through the streets alone. And, you know, I can see that could be possible, you know, because it was a well-known fact that Poe couldn't handle his liquor. So, I mean, he may have, like, wandered out. But then the one thing about it is the clothes that he was wearing when he was found was not his own. So, there was that. Now, like I said, it was a well-known fact that he couldn't hold his liquor. Well, several months before his death, he became like this very vocal. He was really speaking out about, you know, alcohol and its effects, and he was really trying to, I guess, like, sober up or whatever.
Yeah.
And it had been something that he had struggled with all his life. And apparently it was something like many members of his family struggled with, because remember, his brother died from, like, alcohol-related illness. And I read somewhere, too, that a sister had problems with alcohol. Now, at some point before his death, Poe had become gravely ill, and he made a miraculous recovery. Doctors told him that he might not be so lucky if it should happen again. Now, that should be enough to scare anybody sober, you know. And many who had been around Poe just before his death were convinced that he had once again given into the temptation of drinking, and he literally drank himself to death. Now, in 1999, which, I mean, really, you know, compared to this whole story, it's not that long ago, a theory emerged that Poe had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, and that carbon monoxide had came from coal gas that was used for indoor lighting in the 19th century. So apparently they used coal, you know, for the lights and whatnot, and it was carbon monoxide poison. A public health researcher by the name of Albert Donne, I think is how you pronounce his last name, Donne. He took clippings of Poe's hair and tested them for evidence of heavy metals that would be present from coal gas, but the testing was inconclusive, and his theory was discredited. But his test did reveal that there was elevated levels of mercury in Poe's system, like for months before his death. Yeah. Now, the mercury was had more than likely came from, like in 1849, he had been exposed to someone that had cholera. I'm not exactly sure. I know that it's some kind of disease. That's all I really know about it.
Yeah.
But anyway, his doctor had prescribed him mercury chloride, so that's where they think all the mercury that was in his system came from. Now, mercury poisoning would explain the delirium that he was in before he died, but this theory was also discredited because even though his mercury levels were elevated, they were 30 times below the level that it would need to be called mercury poison. They were elevated, but not enough to say that that's what had happened to him. So that was like ruled out. Now, the most recent theory and the cause of his death is that he died from a brain tumor. This is something. This is something that I found interesting. So when they had to relocate his grave to another part of the cemetery that he had been buried in, and once the workers were moving him around, there was like this mass like rolling around inside of his skull. It was like rattling around in there, you know. Well, the brain is one of the first parts of the body to rot after you die, so that mass was not his brain, so that was ruled out. But a pathologist said that the mass could have been a brain tumor, which can calcify into a hard mass after death. So that makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
Now, there was a couple other theories that had been looked at. Rabies, the flu, and murder were all theories that have been looked at. One writer theorized that the brothers of Poe's fiancée murdered him after warning him not to marry their sister. The writer thought that Poe was so frightened by the brothers that he took off for Philadelphia, where he disguised himself in those shabby clothes that he was found in. And then he was heading back to Richmond to marry Elmira. But the brothers caught up with him in Baltimore, where they beat him and forced him to drink whiskey because they knew he would die from it. Now, I suppose that one's kind of possible too. But it's a little far-fetched. I mean, that just seems a little crazy. But, I mean, it could happen.
Yeah.
But now there's this one theory that I talked about on Saturday, and that was that he was the victim of cooping. Have you ever heard of cooping, Alex?
Pooping. I know. I don't think I heard of cooping.
Well, since you didn't know, and if y'all missed it on Saturday, cooping was a method of voter fraud back in those days. Coopers would kidnap their victim, get them drunk or high on opium, and make them dress in a disguise, and then they were forced to vote for a specific candidate under multiple fake aliases. So it's voter fraud, basically. Well, Poe was found outside of a polling station because that saloon, bar, whatever you want to call it back in those days, it had been used as a polling station. Well, and, you know, like I said, he was quite delirious before he died. And, you know, opium can make people delirious, and so can, you know, alcohol, especially people like Poe that has apparently some type of sensitivity or whatever, or anyway, he just couldn't handle it. Now, to me, in my opinion, that's most likely what happened to him. It makes sense. Everything adds up about it, you know. Yeah. And over the years since his death, it's became one of the more widely accepted theories of what happened to him among historians, and that claim was even backed up by a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University. Now, none of these theories have been declared as the cause of Poe's death. We simply just don't know what truly happened to him, and it's really sad that he could never tell us, because he was never conscious long enough after he was found to tell anybody, you know, what happened to him. And nobody knows who that Reynolds person is, you know, that he kept mentioning. Maybe Reynolds he held the secret of what had happened to Poe. He may have taken that secret to the grave. I mean, we don't know, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all I've got really for today. Which, I mean, it wasn't like short information. I think I've talked about it enough. But, I don't know. It's just, I feel like something screwy happened.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think it was natural causes at all. But anyway, that's all I've got for this week's episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Don't forget to come back Wednesday for a new midweek mini episode. And look, this is just a reminder, and I keep forgetting to remind y'all of this. You know, I talk about the Facebook page, but we also, now we have a Twitter.
Whoa.
Did you know that, Alex?
No, until just now. What's it called, Mom? So I can go follow it.
Oh, the Twitter is twitter.com/3mpodcast3. Just like the email address.
Just like
it's
the
the
email
number
address.
3.
This number 3, not the letter 3. I meant not the word 3.
Not the letter 3, the number 3.
The number 3, that's 3M, yeah, you get it already.
Yeah. Well, that's all we've got for today. Alan's, he's got things to do.
Yes.
I want
Like
to take
work.
a nap. But
And we got
anyway,
wrestling tonight. We got some
yeah,
wrestling
there's a
stuff.
pay-per-view that we gotta watch.
We should have done an episode on that, but no, we did Edgar Poe. Yeah, that guy. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, let's end the episode now.
Yeah. Okay, well, y'all have a good week. See y'all on Wednesday. Yeah.
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 Yeah.